Welcome guests here in the room. Welcome all of our online guests to the Overseas Development Institute and to the launch of this report. This event today is for launching the World Disasters Report 2016, titled Resilience: Saving Lives Today, Investing for Tomorrow. The report is on your seats for those of you who are sitting here online. The report is available on ReliefWeb and also on the IFRC website, so go ahead and download it. Today's launch is held in the wake of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was yesterday, which is an important opportunity to reflect on the progress in the way that we handle disasters, that we handle conflicts and other shocks, as well as a reason to reflect on the major gaps that still exist in our approach and through which many lives are still falling. Some evidence of this includes, according to the University of Louvain, the average number of deaths from disasters in the past decade averaged more than 100,000 deaths per year, whereas that was only 68,000 deaths in the last 20 years before that. Last year, the high-level panel on humanitarian financing pointed to, although the international community is spending 12 times as much on humanitarian relief today as it was 12 years ago, the gap between funding and need is estimated at $15 billion. There are more people displaced now from conflict than at any time since World War II. So obviously, current strategies aren't working. We simply are not able to handle the growing humanitarian need with the current approaches that we're using today. This year's World Disaster Report posits that an approach based on strengthening the resilience of countries and communities can be the starting point of change. So first, before we get started, let me introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. On my far right, I have David Sanderson, a professor and inaugural Judith Neilson Chair in Architecture at the University of New South Wales and the co-editor of this year's World Disaster Report. David brings 25 years of experience working across the world in development and emergencies. He's held several senior posts in both NGO and academic sectors and is a member of several NGO and donor advisory boards. He's published papers concerning urban livelihoods, shelter, and disaster risk reduction. Jamila Mahmood, who's probably known to many of you, Undersecretary General for Partnerships, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Dr. Mahmood began her mandate as Undersecretary General for Partnerships at the IFRC in January of 2016. Before this post, Dr. Mahmood was the chief of the World Humanitarian Summit, Secretariat at the United Nations in New York, and she's well known as the founder of Mercy Malaysia, which she led from 1999 to 2009. Adriana Allen, sitting next to me, professor of development planning and urban development at the University College London, was a contributor to the World Disasters Report 2016. Adriana Allen is a professor of development planning and urban sustainability at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at University College London. She has specialized over the years in the fields of urban environmental planning and political ecology. She has more than 25 years of international experience in research and consultancies in almost 20 countries, including Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And on my far left, Tim Waits, Senior Livelihoods Advisor in the DFID Protracted Crisis Hub of Chase. Tim is a senior His policy work has included building resilience to natural and man-made disasters, disaster risk reduction, and the links to climate change adaptation, social protection schemes in low-income countries, and fragile and conflict-affected states, as well as scaling up humanitarian cash transfers. Tim worked on the high-level panel on humanitarian cash transfers last year. His background is in agricultural science and food security, addressing risk and vulnerability of the poorest populations in low-income and fragile countries. I am Christina Bennett. I am the head of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI here in London, and I will be your chair and moderator today. So before we get started, just a little bit about today's program. After an initial introductory video, which we'll show here in London, I am not sure if the online audience is going to be able to see that video. They should be, yes. So you should be able to follow along. Otherwise, that video is also on the IFRC website. You can download it there. We'll then start with 4 presentations from our 4 panelists, followed by a panel discussion among ourselves, sort of question and answer and a bit of a dialogue here for a short while before turning the floor over to you so that you may ask your questions both here in London and online. And then we'll wrap it up and we'll have some refreshments afterwards in the next room. So let's get started. I think there's an introductory video that we will play now, after which we'll begin with the speakers. Thank you very much.
This is our home. When big waves or strong winds come, everything is gone. It takes so long to build back. Then, when we're almost done, there's another wave. We search for a better way to change how we do things, bringing in friends, getting new tools, together we did it. Today we know what to do. And tomorrow, we'll help others to be prepared.
Wonderful. I think that was a very poignant introduction to today's discussion. I like the line, today we know what to do and tomorrow we'll help others to prepare. I think that should sort of emblemize what we will be all talking about today. Can I now give the floor to David, who is the co-editor of the report, to introduce us to what's in this year's report.
I'm just seeing if this works. It does. Great. Thank you very much. Well, it's a real privilege to be sitting here and a real privilege to have been part of the World Disasters Report. On behalf of myself and the other co-editor, Anshu Sharma, we've really enjoyed the process. And we hope the product is something that's useful towards this really vital subject and also a contested one as well. And we try to do that justice in the report. I'm going to spend no more than 5 minutes giving a sense of the essence of the report, and obviously not go through it in detail because it's an awful lot of words and it's there for you to look through and read. Really, the main message, if you like, is that when it comes to humanitarian aid, business as usual is not an option. That's the point. That's the main takeaway of this, that business as usual is not an option. And there are 3 bits the report seeks to argue in that I'd like to just summarize to you. The first one, you won't be surprised to hear, is actually need, increasing need. We had, in 2015, over 100 million people affected by disasters across the world. It has been worse in other years, so mercifully it's less this year, of course, but I don't think anybody will say that's a small figure or that we need to do better. For the first time since World War II, we had over 60 million people forcibly displaced across borders, but of course within countries through Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, you name it, an awful lot of movements around the world. A very big, huge thing. Rapid urbanization, cities, if UN Habitat is correct, grow by 1 million people a week, and that has all kinds of challenges and opportunities. And then last year was the hottest year in record, according to NASA. And one more point, an overwhelmed aid system, largely unchanged in 75 years, acknowledged very clearly by the World Humanitarian Summit in May, and also by the excellent ODI report, Time to Let Go, which came from this very building. The photograph is from Monday in southwestern Haiti, and of course we're all familiar with the news of the hurricane that struck that country 6 years after a terrible earthquake that had billions of dollars pouring into it, and yet is knocked over again. Now, I realize that's a complicated story to summarize by saying that, but that's something for us to bear in mind when we think about this, the need to do better. So that's the first bit the report seeks to touch on. The second bit relates to the problem. And our argument is the problem is not enough support, interest, political will, and certainly money goes into resilience. This is a bit from chapter 3 from the excellent work of Thomas Tanner and Emily Wilkinson, also from here. And this is one of their sort of summaries. They say over a 20-year period, $3.3 trillion went into overseas development assistance, the whole big picture, at which they calculate over 100 billion went into disasters. And if you cut that into 3 bits, it works out at less than 13% went into disaster risk reduction. Even if those figures were a few percent either side, the point is made it's a very small amount, and that equates to something like 40 cents for every $100 currently goes into efforts before a disaster to prevent or reduce the scale of it. And I don't think anyone would think that's a good thing. Now, obviously, we need to spend money after a disaster. It's an overwhelming event, but we need to get better at what happens beforehand, and we argue that resilience provides an opportunity for that. So the third element of these 3 bits, this is opportunity as resilience. This is the report you have in front of you. We were lucky. We had 55 contributors from across the world, from Oceania, from North America, South America, from Africa, from Europe. We're really pleased that it was 28 women and 27 men, so as close as you can get to a balance. I can't think how you get closer, but you take my point. 19 reviewers. Some of the chapters were peer-reviewed 8 times, and I come from the university world, and that's a lot to have 8 peer reviewers. So there are 7 chapters, 34 text boxes. And obviously the point is it's about resilience. Now I know it's a contested word, but the argument is in making the case for resilience that it provides convening power, it's readily understandable, we get it, it works at a different number of levels, it actively seeks to be understandable to development actors and humanitarian actors, to politicians, to decision makers, and embodies an awful lot of what we know works. It's not a new idea, it's been around a long time, and its current understanding is not new. But I would argue that's a strength, because it embodies the evidence of what works. And we might be able to unpack that. It's certainly within our report, within a number of chapters. So the final slide, these are the 7 chapters. The first one is making the case, as I've just said, about convening power, a good enough understanding. The second chapter is proving the case, and that's about measurement and evidence. Many people call it assessments, other people just call it listening, actually to understand how we get what our responses are correct. The third chapter is the money chapter, if you like, talking about investments in resilience and arguing that case. Chapter 4 is anticipation, getting better at getting ready, and talking about scenario planning and forecasting. We had 2 authors from South Africa and Peru collaborate for that, which was really great. Chapter 5, a contributor from New Zealand, in fact, talks about inner resilience and mental health. And as we know, resilience comes from many backgrounds, one of which is psychology, from the world of psychology. So what does it mean at an individual level? Chapter 6, written by an author from India, about partnerships. And as we know, it's all about collaborating and working together. And we make the case in there for the Red Cross's 1 billion Coalition for Resilience, a very important, big initiative, a bold initiative that the Red Cross is pushing across the world. And then finally, Chapter 7, resilience in the future, a little bit of forecasting. And as we know, as a species, we're pretty rubbish at forecasting the futures. But our 2 authors in that do an excellent job, we think, of trying to think about what the futures are, especially around urban growth, around violence, where we talk more about violence in the future and humanitarian action. That's already on the agenda for some. So there's a lot in it. We hope you find it helpful. And I think we're going to talk about it more in the next hour and a half.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much, David. Now could I turn to Jamila Mahmood, who will talk about how the IFRC is embodying resilience by scaling it up in practice.
Thank you very much, Christina. First of all, let me thank HPG and British Red Cross for really convening this launch in London. And a special thanks to David, who's actually just come off a plane from Dakar, where we had our global launch in Dakar. We felt it was really important for a global launch to be in a place where resilience really matters. And our Secretary General was there, so you have to bear with me. You don't have the Secretary General today. As mentioned before, resilience is not a new topic. I think it's something that many of us have been discussing for so many years and debating about it. But we chose it because, and I quote my Secretary General, it's an idea whose time has come. And we live in a time where we know the data shows us that the humanitarian needs are far outstripping our ability to deal with them at an extraordinary pace, a historical pace. And we have really outstripped the resources that are really needed to respond. It's also an idea that states have recognized, most notably through the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, as well as the emphasis on leaving no one behind in the SDGs. And of course, with the recent World Humanitarian Summit, as well as the Migration Summit. And we have Habitat 3 coming along. All of them really a continuum of all the discussions we've had on the whole idea of resilience. And different groups of people will define and view resilience from a very different angle. If you ask the humanitarian, usually the skeptical ones, is probably the only word that links humanitarian and development worlds or the nexus. For the business world, it's really about business continuity. And for the mother who's lost her child, or who has managed to have a child who has recovered, say, from Ebola, that resilience is her personal journey to ensure that that child has a better future. So a very complicated word in some sense, but also very simple in other words. So this is the reason why, when we commissioned the video, I sort of said to the team, explain it to an 8-year-old. And let's keep things simple so that every one of us can understand it. So individual and community resilience, this is what we deal with in the Federation through our national societies. It's a journey. It's not an exercise in box ticking. And we, as humanitarian partners, must be willing to accompany vulnerable people as they reduce risk and adopt new coping mechanisms to build their resilience. It's not enough to support them through one crisis and leave them to cope with the next one. And speaking as IFRC, this accompaniment is precisely why it makes our network of 190 national societies working through 160,000 local branches and 17 million volunteers so unique. It's our volunteers that are there as part of their communities before, during, after any crisis, and they personify resilience. So how can we speak of saving lives if we are not doing enough to prevent those lives from being put at risk? I think these are the challenges we're facing: migration, climate change, protracted conflict. And we know that these crises could possibly have been contained if the world's focus had been on prevention rather than reaction, at least some of them. We will have to move decisively to prevent the crisis of tomorrow where prevention has not been possible. How do we help people bounce back and bounce forward? For one, more international and financing and support must be geared towards a much more integrated, multi-sectoral and flexible approach to building resilience. To put it simply, there isn't enough money. Our answer then cannot just be better response. It must be working to achieve a goal of having less people in need. And indeed, this is what one of the major findings of the UN High-Level Panel for Humanitarian Financing. Often we focus on the grand bargain, but actually the first thing that is mentioned in the High-Level Panel report is actually reducing need. So as David mentioned, business as usual is no longer acceptable. It will only lead to more silent suffering as more and more people exhaust all coping mechanisms and are left to fend for themselves without any help, the help that they really need. So alongside the new research and evidence on the importance of building resilience as presented by this report, which I hope you take time to read, it's quite a heavy report, but I think it's a really, really good one. The IFRC's contribution to this issue includes convening the 1 Billion Coalition for Resilience. And I think this is also this also came out of the World Humanitarian Summit as one of the concrete actions. The 1 Billion Coalition for Resilience, so what does that mean? As we looked around, everyone is doing resilience in some way or other, whether it's a civil society organization, government, donor, everyone's doing stuff on resilience. But this initiative is really to build new partnerships to support more resilient communities. It's a coalition of coalitions worldwide, all encouraging people to take steps to live safer, more resilient lives. So together, we will form networks at local, national, and international levels, both using traditional and digital tools and carrying out wide-scale engagement activities. This is a process in development. IFRC generated an idea. We have a lot of partners now on board, and I hope that at the end of this, more will come on board. And we've created 5 platforms, basically one that's looking at digital and technology, one that's looking at private sector, one that's looking at civil society, one on advocacy, and the other on civil society. And basically gearing up and getting everyone to really share what the steps they are taking towards building resilience, so that we have a place to go that we can actually connect with each other and learn and share. And I think the learning aspect is quite critical. Learning not just from our successes, but also where we've not done really well. I open my remarks by saying that individual and community resilience is a journey. By engaging with and helping us build this 1 billion coalition, we hope that we can work in partnership with each other, with the vulnerable people we wish to support, and really listening to them and really understanding what they define resilience as and how we take that into consideration as we program, as we design or co-design, and then we can travel on that journey together. I mentioned earlier about the importance of funding. I think definitely that's very important, but how do we now remove the barriers between the humanitarian and development actors? And I think this is where, as Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, that continuum of work that we are involved in really helps us rethink and maybe share some of the experiences we have. This report should provide us with a timely reminder of the need to change our relationship with disaster risk. There's so much we can do to minimize the suffering of the world's most vulnerable. The scenes we've seen in Haiti in recent days could be prevented, but by doing so, we will require the commitment of everyone. And I hope that, as our discussions move forward, let's use this as an opportunity now to really, if you like, redesign the way we think about how we respond to humanitarian crisis in the future, and how we engage with the actors who really should be in the room when we are looking at prevention and response. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamila. Resilience is an idea whose time has come. We'll get to that in a moment. But before that, Adriana Allen will speak about the complexities of strengthening resilience in urban environments, and specifically the phenomenon of urban risk traps. And as I understand it, you'll use the example of Lima, Peru to illustrate this.
That's correct.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, well, a real pleasure to be here. Hello also to those who are online. In the 5 minutes I have, what I would like to do is to bring to your attention the condition of systemic risk under which urbanization is taking place across the global south, and why this matters. In this context, urbanization is increasingly coupled with the production of urban risk traps. That is, the vicious cycle through which often invisible everyday hazards and repetitive small-scale disasters accumulate in particular localities and tend to grow exponentially over time. This means that just as urban poverty traps are produced through combined aspects of urban deprivation that over time undermine the potential benefits offered by cities, so do urban risk traps undermine the multiple efforts and investments made by the urban poor and state agencies and many others to mitigate risk. Furthermore, urbanization in risk, or what I would define as the endless reproduction of urban risk traps, reinforces highly inequitable cycles of risk displacement, exposure, and accumulation, with severe impacts on the everyday life of impoverished women and men, as well as the environmental and socioeconomic future of cities. However, and probably surprisingly, urban risk traps are still very poorly understood, recorded, and tackled in policy-making circles. Failure to respond to these vicious cycles increases the vulnerability of the most disadvantaged groups and generates elevated costs for the city and its inhabitants. This highlights the urgent need to reframe urban risk management to advance articulated ways of seeking not just resilient cities, but what I would call urban resilient justice. Building resilience is often taken to be synonymous with positive change. But what happens, for instance, when individuals and communities become resilient by internalizing risk as a given part of urban life, or by struggling to strengthen their capacity to cope, to mitigate, and even prevent risks in isolation from the state and other agents of change? Similarly, what happens when resilience is enhanced by certain groups, social groups, or in parts of a city by displacing or externalizing risk accumulation cycles to other groups, to other areas, or over time? What I'm calling for here is a more explicit articulation of what we mean by seeking urban resilience while leaving no one behind, a central objective of the urban SDG and of the new urban agenda. The case of Lima, where I have been working since 2012, might help to illuminate this point. The images that you can see on the screen show us what living in risk means for a sizable percentage of the population that inhabit the steep slopes of the periphery of Lima. And furthermore, this illustrates the conditions that describe urbanization in risk, not just in Lima, but elsewhere. In the periphery of metropolitan Lima, various waves of occupation have hit the slopes of the poorest districts since the 90s. Initially, this occurred through the collective occupation of land, and more recently, it has continued via individual transactions, driven by the unsatisfied demand for affordable land and housing elsewhere in the city. This shift benefits various forms of land speculation, ranging from the pirate subdivision of plots carved on the steep slopes that border the city, all the way to land trafficking mafias that operate at large scale. The margin settlements are situated over areas of ecological value and high ecological fragility, and form a repetitive pattern of urbanization that constantly reconfigures and renegotiates the edge of the city. What we see here is a backward process of urbanization, in which some form of precarious land tenure security is pursued after claiming settlement in the area and as a means to start the quest for basic services. While this process might attend to some people's needs, a large proportion of the settlers live here in a limbo where assistance from the state is absent or inadequate, and often tied to political clientelism practices. Some of the most commonly experienced hazards here include rock and mud slides, the collapse of built structures, and fires caused by precarious electricity connections, as well as various gastrointestinal and respiratory diseases associated with poor insulation and the lack of water and sanitation. A clear contradiction is found here. While relatively small investments are required to occupy a plot of land, on average about £150 are enough for that, the investments required from local dwellers multiply over time as settlers face high costs in order to make the steep slopes inhabitable. These costs include the investments incurred to flatten the land, gain access to potable water, improve accessibility, and cope with the multiple everyday risks produced by the very effort to occupy the slopes. For those settled in the last 5 years, such costs amount on average to about £10,000. Considering that the average household saving capacity per year is below £300, this means that in effect, newcomers need to go through a lifetime of investments to achieve very basic living conditions. As a result, small-scale disasters tend to accumulate and intensify over time, exacerbating the challenges faced by already impoverished and marginalized groups, and pushing them further into risk traps, which cannot be broken through individual efforts. Furthermore, state and community-led investments to make these areas resilient to shocks tend paradoxically to deepen urban risk traps. For instance, the bulk of public funding in these areas go to building further pathways and staircases to improve local mobility, propelling a process of vertical urbanization higher up the slopes, where newcomers trigger further rock slides in their efforts to carve a plot and face exponentially more difficult and costly investments to access basic services. In addition, efforts to address the rampant maldistribution of risk experienced by both established settlers and newcomers are deeply undermined by their misrecognition and stigmatization. Both groups are perceived by the state as either land traffickers or undeserving occupants of the land. And this means that, more often than not, local dwellers are not entitled to benefit from public investments, but are instead reached by random discretionary interventions. Seeking urban resilience does not necessarily need to lead to unjust outcomes, but unless we articulate both a resilience and a justice perspective in the way we understand and seek to act upon risk, urbanization in risk is likely to remain a reality for many urbanites now and into the future. I don't know if I am on the time or if I can steal 1 minute to recap.
1 minute.
Okay. So if I were to recap, and still 1 minute, the key message that I'm trying to put forward for discussion is that seeking resilience is obviously essential to both save lives today and while investing for tomorrow. But this means confronting a number of significant challenges, and I'm just going to put 3 on the table, hoping that we come back to discuss them. The first is the construction of everyday, that the understanding that the construction of everyday risk happens in an incremental and invisible way. Both formal and informal interventions in the production of a habitat often create risk traps that result in preventable risk disaster events, and I want to emphasize the word preventable. Second, the levels of vulnerability and risk are highly heterogeneous, even among people living in the same area. Factors like gender, socioeconomic dependency ratio, tenure security, and the history of a settlement explain people's susceptibility to risk traps and influence how households internalize or externalize the possible effects of hazardous events. Finally, official evaluations of investments in risk do not account for their full extent, and this is highly problematic. They consider investments in direct responses to manage disasters, but do not show the investments that are unwillingly embedded in the long-term generation of risk through inadequate public and individual interventions to build housing, services, and infrastructure. To meet this challenge, policymakers and many others in a number of fields such as infrastructure, housing, transport, education, and disaster risk management need to design and evaluate their investments in relation to other ongoing, gradually accumulating, albeit small investments made by local dwellers. Policy design, and I finish here, also requires an analysis of the actual impact of risk-increasing interventions, and I repeat this, risk-increasing interventions. A lot of money goes into those. And I'm referring here to the roles that promote the occupation of hazardous areas, as well as the impact of non-investing, for instance, to secure adequate access to basic services, among many other conditions that can reduce people's vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I think there, one of the key messages that the constitution of risk is incremental and invisible, but much of it so preventable, and I think that's something that we'll pick up later. Next, we have Tim Waits, who will speak about how resilience can be strengthened even in contexts of protracted crises and in conflict, and I think this is sort of an unexplored area of resilience as compared to disasters. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present some of this work, because it's fairly new in our conflict, humanitarian and security department, and our DFID's original definition of resilience was very much about natural and man-made disasters. And I think that we are more confident in the natural settings, climate, weather. We're not there yet, but I think that there is a larger body of work, shall we say, than resilience to people who are in conflict and fragile contexts. So about 4 months ago, we set up what we're calling the Protracted Crisis Hub. People ask me what a hub is. I mean, we've got a lot of spokes, I think, and we link in with lots of other pieces of work that is already happening in this area within DFID and beyond. The reason why this is important, DFID spends 89% of its humanitarian funds in conflict-related crises, and these are usually protracted. Globally, 91% of humanitarian assistance is to recipients for medium or long term, so 3 years and beyond. They are receiving humanitarian funding year on year on year. So there's something a little bit different there to the quick onset, and I think we need different ways of working in these contexts. The hub focuses on people displaced by force, so it's refugees and IDPs. 65 million, as was presented earlier. It aims to consolidate and add value to the work that is already going on across our country programmes. And at the moment, we're doing a review where we are actually having video conferences with our different country officers. And we're taking quite a broad brush approach on this. So Zimbabwe is in there, but I think the key context that we're really interested in is Sudan, is South Sudan, Syria, Lebanon and Jordan, the regional compacts, Yemen, Uganda, Ethiopia and Kenya. So these are the sort of places I think that we need to sort of get real and do something a bit different. We're going to consolidate learning and good practice and rethinking framing of how to scale up these sorts of responses. We want to capitalise basically on all the fine words and commitments that have been made this year, and it's been a very, very busy year for conferences. So we had the Friends of Syria conference, we had Wilton Park and the Wilton Park commitments that I'll be talking to later. We had the World Humanitarian Summit, which uncovered so much of this and taught so much about this, and the Obama Refugee Summit, which has just happened. At all of these summits, heads of agencies, heads of governments, heads of development agencies made commitments. And we want to see this actually being translated into programming. So the narrative and policy landscape is changing. Within the refugee context in particular, we're talking much more about holistic livelihoods approaches. We're talking about building self-reliance. And indeed, we're talking about building resilience of refugees and IDPs. I think the narrative goes that over the past 3 decades, academia and public discourse has framed refugees as passive and vulnerable victims. They're in need of protection, and this is usually given externally, not even through the governments of the hosted countries, but it comes in from outside, basically. But they're also agents of their own future. They have skills and education, they have political interests, and as we're seeing through the migration problems, they have dreams of prosperity and they want to contribute. So at the Wilton Park Forum, World Bank, DFID and UNHCR framed a new approach, and it was a new approach around protracted forced displacement, and it came up with 5 principles. The first principle was working through national and local systems. The second was to support host communities and build social cohesion, enable economic participation and stimulate growth, provide impactful and innovative finance, and improve data and evidence. Now, this sounds to me very much like a framing for building resilience. It's kind of the same thing that we're talking about, it's just in this different context. So the sort of things that we're looking at and the sort of focus that we'll be sort of teasing out, I think, is taking long-term programming approaches which focus on livelihoods building, and there's also quite a big discourse within the compacts in Jordan of getting people into work, getting people jobs. Having a harmonised area-based approach which targets both hosting communities and refugees. I think there has been multiple bad practice of refugees receiving greater transfers than people next door who are in the national social protection system, for example. So using long-term social protection mechanisms instead of annualised ad hoc commodity transfers, and of course I have to say this, building up markets and trade by dispersing cash transfers instead of vouchers and stuff. We've got some really interesting work going on at the moment in Lebanon where we are trying to reframe our refugee response more like a social safety net, using more cash than vouchers, because it's a middle-income country, because the Lebanese I've ever met are traders, and because the markets are very resilient in those contexts. However, we still have to do this while addressing the innate vulnerabilities of these populations. So protection still needs to be a very major element of this. Gender and age inequalities still need to be focused on. We still need to think about the sectors, health and nutrition, and whether kids are getting into education. So we mustn't take our eye off the ball that these people are still vulnerable. They still have specific vulnerabilities. So the good news is, from my side, the Wilton Park principles, and this is just happening at the moment, are forming the backbone of the Refugee and Host Population Empowerment Strategic Framework, which is REHOPE, which is a national framing for dealing with displaced people in Uganda. And at the moment, this is very much a draft. I have a draft fresh off the printer here, and it is a draft for comment by the people who are involved. And the people who are involved are the government of Uganda, the World Bank Group, UNHCR, and it's supported by a number of donors, of which one is DFID. And it's taking the Wilton Park principles and making them fit to the actual context of Uganda. So it's talking about government in the lead, and it's talking about harmonised area-based approaches. So it's looking at the whole geography rather than just one particular type of person. Community engagement and empowerment, building on existing programmatic blocks, so not reinventing wheels, not sort of dropping in a brand new approach, harmonise programme tools, build on and strengthen existing coordination structures, equity, gender responsiveness, women's empowerment, and filling the evidence gap. So this is a programme that is at the moment being developed, and we are hoping that the sort of good practice within this may be able to be replicated in countries in the region like Kenya, Ethiopia, maybe under a compact, maybe what that government decides to do. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tim. Interesting, this example of Uganda and sort of emblemizing this livelihood, sort of more livelihood-centered approach that everyone would like to take with regards to refugees. So, I read the report, or much of it, in preparation for this meeting, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And on a topic that, as we all know, we've been dealing with for some time. But I encourage everybody to read it because it has a lot of nuggets and a lot of new information on specific angles on resilience that I found really helpful on cash, on urban. So in that respect, it was a good read and very informative in many places. But I do have to ask you, and maybe I'll turn to David first. A main message of the report is investing in resilience saves lives and money. One question for you: how do we know that? I think we sense it, but how do we know that?
That's a good question. I'm going to start off by saying, because it's a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer. To invest beforehand in things reduces the impact of it happening. But obviously the investments need to be good and they need to be clever and thoughtful. And I think a lot of us would call that development, actually. Just making the link that Jamila talked about. There's tons of evidence relating to DRR, and I see one of our contributors, Marcus Oxley, is just sitting over there. And Marcus has spent a lifetime, as far as I understand it, assembling evidence about good disaster risk reduction. When it comes to the report specifically, I can talk to chapter 3 again, the chapter it's the money chapter basically from Emily and Tom, where it does talk about investing money beforehand. And one example is from Bangladesh, of course, the very famous stories in Bangladesh of the flood warning systems which saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But let me reframe, hundreds of thousands of people killed in the 70s down to small numbers of hundreds, recognizing there are differences in scale and intensity. Some quick figures that government did that's in our report talks about $1 spent yielding $260 a benefit, which is an extraordinary figure. The stuff's in the report there. So that's my opening thought.
Okay, well, that's all well and good, and I'm glad we've got some statistics in there to back up this sense that we have that it is a no-brainer, that it does contribute to spending less if you take a preventative approach. But maybe I'll turn to Jamila on this. If that is the case, if it is a no-brainer, why aren't we able to really operationalize it? Why aren't we able to do it? As we've all said on this panel, resilience is not a new idea. And in fact, the World Disasters Report 12 years ago was also about resilience. We're still talking about it. We're still unable to really grasp it in an operational way. What needs to change? Why, as you said, is this the moment? Has resilience time come?
I'm an incurable optimist, so I will use my optimistic hat again. I think if we've invested the past 1.5, 2 years in looking at how to do things differently, the time has really come to put that into action. I think this is precisely why the World Disasters Report is out and is focusing on this. Now, a large number actually of donors, agencies from the UN and Red Cross, NGOs, have actually signed up to this thing called the Grand Bargain. And the Grand Bargain has 10 commitments, all of which, if you look at closely, from ensuring, increasing support to local and national actors, using cash, addressing the humanitarian development nexus, these are all components that actually will build resilience. And because we have no choice, it's a bottomless pit in how much money you actually put into response. And as generous as donors have been, and they have been increasingly generous over the years, we're just unable to, narrow that gap. So we have no choice but to do things completely differently. So I think, I'm fascinated by what Tim presented, because this whole idea of the rehope, the whole issue now about livelihood development in Zatari camp, you would never have thought about this, 5 to 10 years ago. So yes, I think that it is an idea whose time has come, and we can call it resilience, you can call it managing transition, whatever it is. but it is about doing things differently. And it's about holding development actors to account, and to be, stop getting, just stop looking at things as humanitarian and development, rather than frame the problem and then find the solutions together.
Okay, good. Well, maybe on that, picking up that last point on whether this is a humanitarian problem or a development problem, I mean, there are many that argue that building resilience is not the job of humanitarians, that with limited funds, with limited, capabilities and skills in that respect, with limited timeframes in which we operate, in which we program, is it really our business to be reducing vulnerability at the same time we're supposed to be addressing immediate needs? Many would argue that it is not the job of humanitarians. What would any of you, I guess, say to those people who suggest that resilience really isn't our business?
Are you looking at the donor?
I'll look at the donor.
I'm used to this. Broad shoulders. No, I think this has been one of our sort of calls for many, many years, and I think the WHS, really sort of picked it up, that we have been, I think a lot of people in the humanitarian world, and I'm kind of in the humanitarian world, I'm a livelihoods advisor, but we recognise that we haven't got the tools, the finances, the skills, the knowledge to be able to do the sort of things that need to be done. You need economists, you need governance advisors, you need these sorts of people. So I think people are getting frustrated that it's us calling them in, if you want to look at us and them. But more importantly, I don't think you want to think about it as us and them. I think you really need to do things like, for example, the BRACE programme, which is mentioned in the report. It isn't a humanitarian programme, it isn't a development programme. It's a programme that's meant to be fit to the context that it's working in, be that humanitarian or development. I think we get very diverted by this, actually. Our attempt to do this is that we have multi-year humanitarian programmes. I think we've got £1.5 billion invested in these programmes, and they are working in crisis potential context. The idea is that when things do tip over, an outbreak of extreme poverty, as I sometimes call it, which often it is, you can save lives, but in quiet times you are doing livelihoods actions to build up those contexts. You're doing it within one programme. We're very interested. We've got a big piece of work looking at social protection programmes that can flex and that can work for stressors, potentially shocks, but at the beginning of a drought, at the beginning of even a conflict, what sort of things can you do within your programs that you've got at the moment that can act as your sort of first action, if you like, so it doesn't have to be an external response.
Okay. So maybe let's talk a little bit about Haiti then. You've got this idea in the report about the idea of resilience. If you put it in more colloquial terms, it's about bouncing back, or as we've known it before, building back better. But then there's this also concept of bouncing forward, which is about as much about transformation as it is about getting to sort of the pre-crisis state. And if you look at Haiti, for example, it's a situation post-earthquake in 2010 and now following Hurricane Matthew, where, what do they have to bounce back to? The report, I think, calls it, Haiti's bounced to nothing. What do we do about the Haitis? There's a nice quote by a woman called Jocelyn McCalla of the National Coalition for Haitian Rights, who says, "Hurricane Matthew has disrupted the expected course of events. We should not seek to put Haiti back on course. We should change course altogether. Use disruption to identify another course of action in consultation with Haitians." So maybe going back to David, maybe a little bit also from you, Adriana, what does that mean then, bouncing forward for a country like Haiti, and what does that mean for humanitarian responses?
Shall I kick us off? We purposely avoided conversations about definitions in the report. There are dozens and dozens and dozens. We don't want to go down the rabbit holes of those things. I don't really care. It's about actually, we know it when it's better afterwards. We use the billions that went into Haiti and has done since and will continue after the earthquake to invest in recovery. It's in the immediate relief and recovery, it's getting ready for the next disaster. I mean, even the recovery word is weird. It's getting ready for the next one. So it wasn't like this was an unexpected event. It's hurricanes in the Caribbean. It happened, I mean, it's not an unexpected event. One thing we know, there will be hurricanes in the Caribbean. So it's investing those large amounts of money into the longer term. And just to touch on your last question, if I may, just on that, because it comes down to this development disaster divide, right, which we all know about, and for decades we discussed it. That's based on the model we supplied. That's not demand driven. That's stuff we provide. And so it's even us doing it for them, even the framing of those questions, it's wrong-headed. I mean, every evaluation ever has always come back to better assessments, better listening. And that's the point. And that's why, if we're serious about radical thinking, which I think we are, we need to sort of shut up and listen, actually.
No, and I think some of those challenges you're talking about on humanitarian and development are, as you say, structural. And I think if we start with some of the structural, then we can get to the conversation and to the listening. Adriana, what would you say to somebody about resilience being transformative in a place like Haiti, in an urban setting, where, as you say, sometimes resilience actually entrenches risk?
But I also said it doesn't necessarily have to. I'm saying that we can be more aspirational, no, in the sense that the key message is resilience alone, unless we qualify it, in terms of what does it mean, in terms of finding more equitable path and so on, is not enough. I will come back to that, but I want to add something to your previous question. I think that the point made about the need and the opportunity to link different way of looking at the Haitis, the Limas. I mean, whether big crisis, a small mini crisis, like the one I share, but which accumulate over time and in every city, is an opportunity for both the humanitarian and development sector. I come from a development perspective, and I think that development has a lot to account as well and a lot to change, and these are questions that we are debating all the time. But I think that one key thing that we seem to be struggling with is the issue of managing uncertainty. And we cannot say that we have discovered uncertainty since acknowledging that climate change is a reality. There are multiple levels of uncertainty: political uncertainty, climatic uncertainty, and so on. And we do live, this is a given. The way in which, the world in which we operate, the world in which we live, whether you come from a planning perspective, development planning perspective, or a humanitarian perspective, is full of uncertainty. So I think that the key question is that we can't keep on pretending that we are shocked when confronted with conditions of uncertainty. Now, my point about, I think that resilience, again, is, even just the bouncing back, if not forward, is extraordinarily important, and it gives a very important twist, particularly to the way in which disaster risk management has been working. The idea that you're not just mitigating negative impacts, but you are building something positively. And I think that a lot of the appeal of the notion is precisely that. We are talking about the possibility of building something positive. However, my point is, without taking any merit from that, is also to look at the everyday, and to look at the everyday more perhaps from a development perspective. The world in which I work has to do with cities, and again, the trend of facing not just urbanization, but urbanization in risk is another systemic condition. Like, climate uncertainty. We cannot be surprised by that. We cannot be surprised by the number of people that are going to die in Lima when the next ENSO, the next cycle of the El Niño or La Niña hits. Is waiting to be called. So I think that, again, managing uncertainty, living with uncertainty, and rethinking the way we approach planning, development, and humanitarian aid from that condition of uncertainty is crucial.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe just to Tim, this idea of
all the tough questions.
Bouncing forward. Sorry about that. This idea of bouncing forward. I mean, you're specializing in conflict and protracted conflict, and you've talked a little bit about how the resilience questions, can be phrased in terms of how we deal with it in conflict settings, and particularly in forced displacement settings. But talk to me a little bit about what resilience entails, or bouncing forward entails in a place like Kabul or Bentu or Donetsk, as opposed to a more sort of straightforward disaster setting. And in that answer, if you could talk to me a little bit about what that means for humanitarian principles, the idea of this coherence that we're talking about here. What does that mean for the idea of working in a neutral, impartial, and independent way?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. No, I mean, we are in close coordination and conversation with ICRC. I want to say that first. because this is not an excuse for human rights abuses. This is not a way of building people's resilience to some of the awful things that happen in these contexts. You know, international humanitarian law is your first. That's the one that you have to gather behind. I think what we're interested in is how can you do your programming in Syria in a way where you're not bouncing forward. I mean, you're almost trying to keep things at a place for when peace breaks out. So there's a few examples of ways of working that the team in the Syria team are looking through. And there's questions like, do you immediately revert to water trucking? Or do you give investments into the water system that already exists? And the idea of sort of keeping that water system going is that you've got the foundations for when peace breaks out. If you're building a school or thinking about education, where do you site that school? Should it be underground? Should it be hidden? It's the bar's low. Basically, the bar is low. But I think there is still other program you can do, which is taking a sort of a 5-year vision, and you have to do your scenarios, very broadly and very carefully. And I think as importantly is, what do you do with your financing? Rather than this ad hoc, annualized programming in a protracted crisis like that. I mean, we were saying it in the 90s in South Sudan, we're going to be here for 20 or 30 years. Why do we get 1 year? It's so disruptive to your programs. So that's the kind of things we're trying to change. And one, I don't think it's rocket science, and two, it's not massively ambitious, but we're spending so much money in those contexts. It's just doing things like that, you can save a lot of money.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. Okay, good. Maybe just one final question before I turn it over to you, to Adriana, about building resilience in urban environments and some of the inequalities that you've described in your presentation. Tim has suggested that cash, and in the report this also suggests that cash is sort of potentially the great equalizer for building resilience, and particularly in urban settings. I wanted to know if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I think that Tim also mentioned the importance of embedding cash transfers into social nets, and I think that's very important. So one problem I think we have, especially when it comes to money and how to spend it, is the use of, in my view, of very individualized and individualizing solutions or tools. So what I have seen, for instance, I'm thinking an equivalent of cash transfers. I mean, you look at Lima and you think, well, all of you are familiar with the work of Fernando de Soto and the idea that, if you give people individual titles, you will unleash the capital of the poor and so on. Having looked in detail at where that hypothesis took Lima, I can see quite the opposite. What you find is that precisely individual titling has propelled the selling of plots and so on, and people, the same households, like cashing whatever they can and moving further, up the slopes and so on. So it has been quite disable to change the course of these urban risk traps. And I think that the key issue is how do we support people? Of course, there is a need for individual support, but we need to think again much more systematically about support, and not just the targeting of individual households or even groups, but of people being able to work collectively. And I find, for instance, that what seems to be paying much more is experimentation, and you find a lot of that in Brazil with collective forms of land tenure. And you find that everywhere. You find that in India, in many places, where you are somehow unleashing social capital, but in collective terms, not in market terms. And so people don't get trapped in the same need for cash. And I think that we need to think carefully about that. We also need to think about the role of the state. And I think that is very, very important, because my issue only with building resilience when proposed critically is this idea of saying, what are we saying? Are we saying that in the past it was okay for the state to build cities, to build shops and so on, and now the poorest have to internalize the whole cost of providing water, electricity, sanitation, education and so on? Is that fair across generations? There is clearly a role for the state, not just for humanitarian sectors, for ODA to play. And I think that it is that contract that needs to be thought very very carefully. And again, I see lots of wonderful examples there. I was mentioning earlier today, for instance, if you look at the case of Manizales in Colombia, the introduction of social insurance against risk is very, very interesting, and is a mechanism embedded in the local municipal finance that basically operates as a cross-subsidy, where those settled in formal areas are covering for the insurance for to recover, to help recovering those on informal settlements when they are hit by mudslide, landslides, and so on. So I think that there is a lot of that happening, but again, it's not just money, and the state has to be there as well. We have to think of forms of universalizing. I think that this has been, we have gone through 20 years of going down in ambitions and saying, okay, let's target. Let's, think about that. No? In the 80s, we're talking about universal access to water and sanitation. In the 90s, we started to talk about halving the need for, the deficit of those without water and sanitation. So there has been somehow, I think that a shift in the aspirations that the planning, the development sector, and the humanitarian sector have. And I think that we need to be much more aspirational.
Great, thank you, wonderful. So thanks to all the panelists for answering my questions. Those were my questions about the report. Let me ask you, you haven't had a chance to read the report yet, but let me turn to you to see if you have any questions for our panelists on what you've heard today or anything else having to do with resilience. I would ask you to use the microphones to state your name and affiliation, and to address a particular speaker if you can. I'll start with the audience here in London and then switch to online. So are there any questions? I'll take a couple at a time. Yes, please, go ahead.